welcome to Folkestone Library, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to have you all here today. You may have noticed we've got an exhibition which is in partnership with the British Library called Breaking the News, these huge Toblerones that you can't miss. Do have a look at those. And in conjunction with that, we have a very special guest with us tonight. It's author Paul Ilett, all the way from sunny Southend, to talk to us about his books and his experience in journalism. Welcome, Paul.
Welcome. Thank you. So I thought I'd start just by giving you a little bit of background about myself as well and my career, and then I'll talk a little bit about the inspiration for my first book, which I published in 2014, and also a little bit about the book that I'm about to publish as well. So I started my career as a local newspaper journalist when I was about 20 years old, and I worked for 10 years as a journalist and all. I did local newspapers. Hello. I did local newspapers, commercial radio, and then I worked for the BBC for 5 years, and I did my final year with the BBC was actually in the late 90s, and I was one of the first journalists to work on the BBC News website because that had just recently launched at the time, which was quite an exciting time to be a journalist. Since then I've moved to the other side of media, and I've worked in communications, so I've worked in government, local government, NHS, private sector, public sector, and in charities as well, which is a very different relationship because obviously you're feeding stories to the media and trying to get them to publish them for you, and that's also quite an interesting learning curve in terms of the way the different newspapers handle different stories that you give them. When I wanted to write a book, I just took a piece of advice that a lot of very successful authors say, first-time writers, which is that you should write about something that you know. So I did think the best thing to do would be to write about the media, because I've worked in many different parts of the media. And I started writing Exposé in 2012. So this was straight off the back of something called the phone hacking scandal, which some of you may remember. But I will just talk a little bit about the phone hacking scandal, just for those who aren't particularly familiar with it. This was something that happened throughout the late 90s and noughties, but it was a very slow burning story that kind of got revealed over a period of years. And what the story involved were journalists at the News of the World newspaper. There's suggestions other journalists did it as well, but we know that the News of the World journalists did it. And they were using very corrupt and actually criminal procedures to actually find out information about people in the public eye, not just actors and pop stars, but politicians, members of the royal family, and even the victims of crimes as well. And I'll come on to the victims of crimes later on. Now, 20 years ago, mobile phones were very different to how they are now. They were very basic. Some of them had cameras on them, but there was nothing like internet access that we've got now. Basically, they were just a phone. And if you phoned someone and you didn't get through, you'd go through to voicemail. And what the journalists at the News of the World found out is that if you phoned up someone and went through to their voicemail, if you guessed their PIN code, then you'd probably go through and be able to listen to their voicemails. And the PIN codes that were set at the time were either 0000 or 1234. And a lot of people at the time didn't bother changing this. They just kept them because it was too complicated to change it. So it was actually very easy to hack people's phone numbers and get through to their voicemail and listen. This was illegal, so it certainly wasn't something that they were doing legitimately. The reason that it came into the public domain were a number of high-profile stories about this, the main one being about 2005, 2006, Prince William realised that his phone had been hacked because the News of the World was finding out stories about him that very, very few people knew. In fact, they even found out about a knee condition that he had that only he and his doctor and one other person knew about. He informed the police investigated this for a month, and after a month they realised that actually Prince William's phone hadn't been hacked. It was actually one of his royal aides whose phone had been hacked. And they even realised which reporter it was, and also a private investigator that the News of the World had been using. And over a period of years, the News of the World had paid this private investigator about £140,000 for his services. So obviously they knew that he was doing something that was making their money as well. So they put them under surveillance for 6 months, and then 6 months later, they raided the News of the World offices, they raided the Royal Reporter's desk, they also raided the home of this private investigator. They found 11,000 pages of handwritten notes, all about different people in the public eye, several hundred people in the public eye. Some of them were celebrities, some of them were sports people, there were members of the royal family. And it just became very apparent to everyone that phone hacking was now a typical way the News of the World was actually finding out stories about people. The royal reporter and the private investigator went to court. They both admitted what they had done. The royal reporter was sent to prison for 4 months, the investigator for 6. But over the next few years, the police had to continue investigating this, and there was a lot of information for them to investigate. So it took a long while for all of this to come out, and more celebrities and people in the public eye started suing the News of the World for damages when they found out they had been the victim of phone hacking. And the public went with this. It was a very interesting story. You know, mostly it was just celebrities, and people thought, well, this is a bit titillating. You know, we'll see how this goes. What really changed the public's attitude to it, though, was in 2011, the Guardian newspaper found that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked by the News of the World. Now, Millie Dowler was a teenager who lived in Surrey, and she was murdered in 2002, but her body wasn't discovered for 6 months. And over this 6-month period, the News of the World was hacking her mobile phone to see if they could find out any information. Unfortunately, what this meant is the police believed Millie Dowler was still alive and was accessing her voicemails, and this obviously then gave her parents false hope that Millie Dowler was still alive. And when that story broke, that very much changed the public attitude towards the News of the World. It was also discovered that they had hacked the mobile phone numbers of family members of soldiers who'd been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also that they had hacked the mobile phone numbers of relatives of people who'd been killed in the 7/7 bombings in London in 2005 as well. All of this massively changed the public attitude towards the News of the World. The paper was closed after about 160 years in publication. Rupert Murdoch closed the paper. 200 people lost their jobs at News of the World, and Rupert Murdoch was forced into cancelling plans to take over B-Sky B as well. Other people went to court. There was about 100 people in all that were charged. Mostly they weren't found guilty of any crimes. A few other people were sent to prison. But I think the point of view of the public, beyond the fact the News of the World closed, there was a sense that a lot of people had got away with it. And there was a sense of injustice around the fact that more people had been sent to prison. So in 2012, after all this happened, I had a job where I was doing an awful lot of driving. And so I was listening to the radio a lot. I was listening to the day programme in the morning, or my local station, BBC Essex, and also the PM programme in the evening. And this was a story that just was constant. Every day for the best part of the year, it was another phone hacking story, another phone hacking story. And over the course of that year, a story began to form in my head about what if these reporters had it done to them? What if someone turned the tables on these reporters and started exposing their private lives and finding out what their secret shames were? And that's really where the idea for Exposé came from. What really sort of finalised it was an interview that I read in one of the Nationals with a newspaper executive who had been charged with phone hacking and then found not guilty, but he'd lost his job, and he did an interview in one of the Nationals saying what a terrible thing it was because he'd had a 6-figure salary, he'd had 2 company cars, he'd had an expense account, and how terribly sad it was for him that he'd lost his job. And just a real terrible sense of entitlement in the way that he spoke, as though he didn't understand why this was considered such a bad thing. There was no empathy or sympathy at all for the victims of phone hacking or Millie Dowler's parents. It was very much, isn't it terrible that I've been treated like this? And that sense of entitlement really, and the sense of corruption, really runs throughout every page of my first book. The story is very simply, there's an actor called Adam James. He has a long history with a newspaper called the Daily Ear, which is the world's most salacious tabloid, based not, a little bit on things like the Sun and the Mail. And he's become very, very rich. So he hires a team of ex-journalists and private investigators to investigate the people at the Daily Ear. And every 3 days he publishes a scandalous story about someone at the Daily Ear, something terrible that they've done. The book became quite successful. I got a lot of very good reviews early on. I even had a 5-star review in the Sun newspaper, which was quite something. Bear in mind, it was the Sun that was parodied in the book. But I also got really great reviews in magazines like Attitude magazine, and also on Goodreads, which is a really big website for book lovers. I've got a 4.5-star rating on there, and also 5-star ratings on Amazon as well. So the book actually did very well for a self-published author. It went down quite well. If you do self-publish a book, usually you can expect to sell about 250 to 300 copies of your book. Exposé, to be fair, has been out for 8 years, so it's been out a long time, but I've actually sold about 35,000 copies of the book around the world. And I do have a lot of people contacting me asking if there's a sequel coming up, which there is later on this year. So it did go down quite well, and I was very pleased with that. Self-publishing, when I did it 8 years ago was very different. It was very piecemeal. You had to go to this place to get this bit done and that place to get that bit done, and it was very difficult to take a cohesive approach to self-publishing a book in a way that was going to make it look professional. But there are now publishing houses that actually help self-publishing authors who do the whole lot for you. They'll design the covers for you, they'll do proofreading, copy editing for you, they'll do the internal layout, the external layout, and they'll also do publicity for you as well, all within one house. So it is much easier to actually self-publish a book and actually make it look like a professional enterprise as well. So self-publishing has changed. And there are a lot of very successful self-published authors out there as well, who have sold millions of copies, much more than I have. But it's no longer something that's frowned upon. It's no longer called vanity publishing. Self-publishing is now considered a very legitimate way of authors to get books out there. A lot of publishing houses, they are closing down really their interest in new authors. They're focused much more on celebrities and people that have already got track record of publishing. So it is very difficult for new authors to get heard and to get those deals. And so self-publishing really is a really important way and a legitimate way of getting books published if you want to do something like that. My new book is going to be out in August, I hope, if I can get it timed in time. And it's a sort of sequel to the first book. The only difference is this time, rather than reporters at the Daily having embarrassing stories being told about them, they're actually being killed by a serial killer, which is, I think, is much more fun. So I'm hoping that will do well. But I did learn some interesting things about self-publishing the first time round, and I think the biggest lesson I learned is don't be afraid to ask an expert. So I wish I'd gone to someone who knew about marketing to help me with it, because I was guessing, because I'm not a marketing expert at all, and I was guessing at the marketing. I didn't really know what genre my book was, so that was difficult to work out. Is it a thriller? Is it a comedy? Is it LGBTQ, because the main character's a gay man? And that was very difficult also to know which readership I should be aiming the book at as well. And also just making sure that it's properly proofread as well, because the first copy went out there with quite a few spelling mistakes, and that was quite embarrassing. So it has been properly proofread. But there's, I think actually pitching your book to the right audience through the right channels is probably one of the biggest challenges a self-published author will have, and that's why it's really important, I think, to make sure that you're getting that sort of marketing advice and that professionalism as well in terms of a proper marketing campaign for your novel as well. So that's really an overview of the inspiration for my book, which is the phone hacking scandal, and also self-publishing. I hope that was helpful. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, there is some Prosecco here should you wish to have another glass. Yes.
At the beginning, regarding the phone hacking story, obviously Murdoch sold the journalist down the river by giving all the source material, but at the same time, just prior to that, he was hiring a lot of ex-members of the Met Police who still had contacts in the right places. So do you think that Murdoch should be allowed to continue as a press baron? Because what does it mean, a free press? Well, we haven't got it with Murdoch. No. And can we trust Murdoch? I don't think we can, knowing what he's done to former journalists. Personally, I mean, that's my take on it. But
I think that after it all died down and a number of people had gone to prison, that there was most definitely a sense in the public that the people who were ultimately to be held responsible had gotten away with it. So the editor of The Sun at the time, the editorial director of News International, Rupert Murdoch himself, James Murdoch, his son, there were lots of lines that actually they were aware and had actually approved this and had gotten away with it. And I think that's something that was a sense of injustice that was left with the public. Interestingly, I mentioned this earlier on actually, there was an interview with the Prime Minister of New Zealand about 2 months ago, and she was asked, why in New Zealand does there not seem to be a problem with toxic masculinity amongst your male population? And she said, well, I've never allowed Rupert Murdoch to own a newspaper here. So there's a real sense that there is a problem with Murdoch's papers. And in America, if you think of something like Fox News, which is blamed for persuading people to vote in a particular way and hold particular opinions, there's very much an issue in terms of someone like Rupert Murdoch owning so much media. But off the back of this, he was blocked from owning B Sky B, so that was a repercussion on his business but certainly there wasn't actually a repercussion on him of the phone hacking scandal beyond that. So I do take your point, and actually part of the corruption that the police investigated was about payments to officials and so on. It wasn't just phone hacking. So the suggestion was that police themselves had been involved in this to some degree by taking payments from the News of the World as well. But it's an interesting point. It's never been proven, and that's why he continues as he does. But I think there's a lot of suspicion out there that people in very senior places were able to get away with it in the way that more junior staff, reporters, weren't able to get away with it. Yes, sir.
I hope I didn't miss the answer to this question. Did you ever go to publishers, or did you actually want to do self-publishing yourself?
I did approach, I probably approached about 3 publishing houses and a couple of agents. I got very lovely feedback, I have to say. You know, none of them, I think they're very good at sending sort of template letters back, but I got letters that actually referenced parts of my book and characters, so I knew that someone had actually read what I sent in. But I think the problem I had is that my first book it doesn't really fit into a particular genre, which is a lesson I've learned. It's sort of a comedy thriller, and I think a book either needs to be a thriller or a comedy really to get a publishing house or an agent interested. I was quite excited about the idea of self-publishing because I'd read a lot about it, and it seemed quite a good way to go. And I knew some very successful authors who started off by self-publishing, so it didn't make me feel that it was a lesser venture in that respect. But no, I was rejected by quite a few before I went down the self-publishing route. So, I know, absolutely. But I think probably a lot of self-published authors, I mean, this time I haven't gone to anyone. I've literally just gone down the self-publishing route with my second book. And this is very much a murder mystery, so it's going to be a much easier genre to target an audience with. Because I know how to do it now, it just seemed easy to say, I'm going to self-publish again.
How responsible do you think we as the audience are for the journalism that we get? So, I mean, you're talking about something that happened in the 90s, and your book came out much later, but we are still, I would believe that money will be changing hands in certain places to get the stories that we get, that ex-police will be used to get things across. So how much, what's going on with the fact that on the one hand people were appalled by what happened, but on the other hand, even I looked down the sidebar of shame on the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
What is that about?
We are culpable, without a shadow of a doubt. And it's actually a theme that's in Exposé, that newspapers only do this because people buy them. And if every time they did a huge exposé on someone's private life and people went, well, I'm not buying that, the newspapers wouldn't run those sort of stories. I mean, it's a money-making venture rather than news venture. I struggle with the idea of public interest arguments around exposing someone's private life, because as a member of the public, I don't see why it's any of my business. You know, for Premiership footballers having an affair, that's very unpleasant. You know, it's not very nice for his wife or his kids. Is that any of my business really, though? Is it in my interest to know that? I don't think it is. If our Prime Minister is you know, having odd relationships with Russians who have close relationships with Putin, I think there is a legitimate public interest argument in investigating that. But I don't understand the public interest argument about celebrities in their private lives or sports personalities in their private lives unless they're actually uncovering genuine corruption. I think there's a difference between public interest and people just being nosy. And I think we, as newspaper buyers, are nosy. The sidebar of shame, a perfect example of that. Although that is quite addictive, and all that clickbait stuff on social media is terribly difficult to avoid and not give into. But I do think it's something that the public has to consider. You know, when Princess Diana died and there was a huge backlash against the paparazzi, that's all very well and good, but were you buying the newspapers that had Princess Diana paparazzi shots in them leading up to that? You probably were, you know. Not you personally, so I'm talking generally. But it is an issue that people have to take responsibility for the press that we have. If we're not buying those newspapers, they would change in order to make people want to buy them. And I think over the years, particularly since the 70s, when a paper like The Sun began to really do tabloid journalism on a grand scale, I think it's dragged down our expectations of what we can expect from our tabloid press, in particular the tabloid press in this country. Although I think some of the online newspapers as well, the Daily Mail online, for instance, which is actually very different to the Mail itself, the clickbaitiness of it is terrible. But it's one of the biggest news websites in the world, so people are enjoying it. But I don't think you can complain about the press if you then go out and buy those newspapers. Yes, I mean, we get angry about it, but I don't think people take responsibility for it. And people need to. They need to start thinking, well, this happens because I'm putting money into that business. And people don't do that.
How did you actually start? What are your tips for actually starting a novel and finishing a novel? And would you know how it's going to end before you started writing it?
So I did a lot of research around writing techniques, and if you actually look at some of the most successful authors in the world, they all have different writing techniques. So if you take someone like Jackie Collins, who is one of the most successful authors of all time, whatever you think about a book, she's one of the biggest selling authors of all time. Her writing technique is that she would sit down and start writing. I'm not saying she would make the whole story up, but she would basically make the story up as she went along. She probably had a general idea where the story was going, but she didn't really do chapter plans or character notes, things like that. And it worked for her. She came up with brilliant books that sold millions. J.K. Rowling, by comparison, sits down. She had a plan for every single Harry Potter book before she even sat down to write the first one. She knew exactly what his story was from year one right through to his final year at school. So people have very different writing techniques. Before I started, my first book I was lucky because I was doing all this driving. By the time I sat down to write my first book, I knew the whole story from start to finish. I even knew what the final line was going to be. So that was but I've heard that for first-time authors, it tends to be quite organic, really, in terms of how you write your first book. But I still wrote down all the chapter plans. I had character notes. I had a timeline as well, because a lot of the stuff referenced events before the book, and I wanted to make sure that I had an idea of what happened in this year before and so on. And that's how I wrote. And I did the same for my second book as well. I had chapter plans and I had character notes and also notes back to the first book so I could refer to things. But that's just what I was comfortable working with. It did help me though write because I always knew what was coming up in the next chapter and I knew what I had to conclude in that chapter. And that helped me going as well, because even if I was struggling with a chapter, often I'd look forward and go, oh, but this bit's coming up, so I need to get to that. And when you're writing a book for 2 years, it can get quite challenging to keep going, particularly when you're working full time, as I still do. And you've got childcare responsibilities and other things going on. But it helps me to have that level of detail. But I do know there are other writers far more successful than me that will sit down and make it up as they went along. Enid Blyton, another great example, would sit down and the famous 5 books, she would literally make it up as she went along. I'll put an island in here and there's some robbers in a cave, or do that as well, and they were brilliant books, they were great fun. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way to write a book. I just think you need to find the right way for you.
I particularly liked in the book the social media clips that went between the chapters. And I just wondered that when you published, did you get much in the way of social media comments and inflammatory stuff where people would take things out of context and because it was hilarious in the book, I have to say. And I just wondered what your experience was of tweets and such like afterwards when you published.
It's interesting. So for those who haven't read the book, every 3 days, the actor Adam James will publish a scandalous expose about someone at this newspaper, and there'll be the fallout from that, and then there'll be a break in the narrative, and I would basically write what would be on social media, what the social media response would be to this scandal, so you get an idea of what ordinary members of the public were saying and thinking about this expose. And that was a great part of the book to write, I have to say. I really enjoyed doing that. And it gave the book a rhythm as well that readers kind of quite enjoyed. They knew that there'd be a build-up to an expose, there'd be an expose, there'd be the fallout, and then you'd have the social media, and it was something that readers quite enjoyed. I didn't get scandalous tweets, I have to be honest, which is useful. I don't know about the new book, but social media is interesting though and fascinating, because I was getting contacted by people from Australia, from America. I had some lovely comments actually from some people in America who'd read the book in one day, which I was really surprised about. I've even had tweets from Germany. So for me, social media has been really positive up to now in terms of people contacting me to tell me they've enjoyed the book. I did have one academic contact me, and he gave me a list of things he thought I'd got wrong, which was useful. Feedback, I suppose. It's not a particularly academic book, to be honest. It's fun, but it was that was interesting. But mostly, social media has actually been, in terms of my book, social media has actually been very positive up till now. Yeah.
Behind you, can we trust the news?
Mm.
So, if we go back to the HSBC, which was Henry Lefebvre, and at the time the Telegraph were running a HSBC advert, but they didn't dare criticise HSBC. And then, the one further down, what does it mean? What does a free press mean? So looking around the UK on a wider spectrum at the moment, we've got, over in Bristol, we've got like the Bristol Cable, which is owned by the community. It directs where it goes, what it does. It's self-funded. Up in Manchester, we've got the Meteor. Over in Norfolk, we've got the, I forgot what they go under, but there, up in Northumberland, we've just had one just open up, one in Cumbria, the Ferret in Scotland. I mean, with the way the media is, the fact that like locally our local paper would not dare criticise anybody because they're too frightened. So how do you see a free press in the future, given that newspapers are dying? They are dying.
Yeah. So when I mean, it's an interesting point, because when I started working in local press in 1990, there was an enormous amount of local newspapers. My first job was a trainee reporter on the Malden and Burnham Standard. So our catchment area was probably about 100,000 people, if that. And yet Malden had its own newspaper office in the High Street. There were 5 journalists working there, including a newspaper editor just for that paper. We had 2 members of advertising staff downstairs just for that newspaper. We had our own photographer. And it was a big operation to put out this newspaper once a week. And there were thousands of newspapers like that across the country. Little villages had their own newspapers, small towns. And it's been really sad for me to see over the years so many of those newspaper offices closing down. Newspapers have been merged across county boundaries into one single newspaper. And in terms of the impact on editorial staff, so my job was very simply to come up with 3 or 4 stories a day. That was all I had to do. A local newspaper journalist now would have to come up with probably about 10 stories. They'd have to copy edit them themselves, which for someone who can't spell like me, that would be a nightmare to do. Have to actually edit my own stories. They might even have to do page layout now as well, because they've got rid of a lot of sub-editors. So the quality of your local newspapers is going down, not through any fault of the staff. They just have too much to do. The actual amount of local news is going down. So when I worked in local government, I began to realise that council meetings that were quite important had fewer and fewer local newspaper reporters coming to them as well. So a lot more of that was done at the desk the next day, phoning up saying, can you tell me what happened at the council meeting last night? And of course I could, but the interesting stuff is actually in the discussion at the council meetings about, councillors from opposing points of view having a good old row. That's where the interesting stuff comes at local democracy level. But that's just been lost now. And that's a great shame. So I think in terms of local media, it's been greatly weakened and diminished over the past 20 years. And I think that's a great loss across the country. I'm a big fan of local media. I think in terms of advertising, it's interesting what you're saying about local papers. I remember I worked for a daily paper in the early 90s, and there was a local company, a big store that had a lot of advertising in this particular paper. And there was a very negative story about it. And I cannot remember what the story was, but there was a very negative story about it. And a reporter wanted in saying, I found out this. The whole newsroom went quiet, and they had to go down and have a discussion with the advertising team first to see how the advertising team felt about it, because it might impact on the income from this particular business. So even at local level, the influence of advertisers and the power of money was compromising journalism to a degree. I mean, on this case, they still went ahead and ran the story, but there might be newspapers that wouldn't run a story if it was going to upset an advertiser. I think at national level...
But does it compromise the journalists, or does it compromise the editors and the owners?
It compromises the journalism, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a trainee journalist, you don't have a say into what gets published. Last week about Boris Johnson and his wife, trying to get his wife a job in the Foreign Office, and the Times dropped the story because they got a phone call from Boris's office saying, please don't run the story, so they actually dropped it. You've got major investors, having influence over newspapers and the direction of their narrative around things like the EU and Brexit and funding for the NHS and Channel 4 being sold off. So there's lots of things that are influencing our national press, which is to do with money rather than journalism as well. So I don't think we necessarily have a free press in this country. We have people who want to have a free press, but the pressure of money and politics on newspapers at different levels is very real, and I think we need to accept that. So it is a worry. I'm really sad about what's happened to local journalism, because a lot of local journalists go on to have great careers at national level, and I think that pathway is diminishing as well. And I think a lot of stories that are actually uncovered at local level go on to be national stories as well, and I think we're losing that sort of interest in local news more generally. But I think overall the influence of money and advertising on journalism in newspapers, it's a very real influence, and I think that readers just need to be very aware of that as well. I think in terms of coverage of local councils, I suppose it comes back to the issue earlier on that we spoke about, that local journalists are getting out to fewer and fewer council meetings, so they're probably writing stories from press releases, from council agendas, and they're not putting in the challenge that they would put in if they had a bit more time and if they're able to attend council meetings. So that I think the challenge on local councils is lessened because there are fewer journalists now to do that challenging and to actually have that continuity in terms of, oh, I know this story because I've been covering it for 7 months. A lot of that has been lost, unfortunately. It might be something to do with the funding. I'm not sure what the local arrangements are entirely. But certainly, when I was in a local newspaper, I worked in Chelmsford, for instance. Chelmsford Council paid a lot of money in advertising to us, and this was basic stuff around, things like road announcements and things like that. But me and my colleagues were more than happy to write negative stories about the council where they deserved it. We never felt pressure at that time to follow a company line and be kind to the local authority. But that's probably different from one area to another and from one newspaper to another as well.
So I just wondered what your thoughts and fears for the future of the BBC are.
I think the BBC has a tough job, because I think if you actually look online, there are as many people on the left saying there's a right-wing bias at the BBC as there are people on the right saying there's left-wing bias at the BBC. So it is very difficult. There are different parts of the BBC as well, and they're not all necessarily aligned. So BBC News Online seems to sometimes take a different editorial approach to stories than a BBC local radio station would, or that Newsnight does. I think it's not helpful when you've got news presenters, who become the target of, this presenter. I mean, I know the presenter of Question Time is routinely considered to be a Conservative Party supporter, and that this is obvious in the way that she presents the show. I don't watch Question Time, so I can't really say, but that's a theme that plays out on social media all the time now, that she's silencing people on the panel who are left-wing and giving too much time to people on the panel who are right-wing. And it's a very, very difficult thing for the BBC to manage, because you've got a population who all fund the BBC, they all have expectations and a sense of entitlement over the BBC, and it only takes one news story for a group of people to say, well, this proves we were right all along. Clearly there's an issue with the BBC being right-wing or left-wing. I would hate to see the BBC changed particularly, or defunded, and I know that defund the BBC is a hashtag that comes up on social media quite regularly. I think it's a really important part of this country, and just in terms of the local journalism that BBC delivers. I live in Essex. BBC Essex is fantastic. I assume there's a BBC Kent. Is there a BBC Kent? These sort of local BBC radio stations are really important. At a higher level, I know that the local BBC TV services are being merged. So I know that BBC East has just been merged with Midlands, I think. So that's become a more general TV service in terms of local news. And I'm worried that BBC local radio stations might start suffering the same fate. So I can imagine at some point BBC Essex being merged, possibly with BBC Kent or BBC Suffolk or something like that. And I think that would significantly diminish the amount of local journalism that's being done. I think it would be a great shame. So the BBC isn't perfect. The BBC News Service most definitely isn't perfect. But I still think it's something that's worth defending and sticking up for, because I think overall it does a great job. And particularly in terms of local news, I think what it does is invaluable.
Do you think we can trust the BBC to be impartial and to be honest? And do you think we can rely on it to be around in the next 5 years doing that?
I think overall we probably can. I think there are certain issues that I think personally it's probably not great on. But I think what it needs to do is, I think anyone who's ever followed a complaint within the BBC in terms of news coverage will know that the complaint service at the BBC is designed to defend the BBC rather than actually to investigate a complaint impartially. And I think that's what the complaint service at the BBC needs to do to reassure people. The first thing they do is actually throw a load of policies at you to say, actually, this story is fine because of these policies. It doesn't actually look at the context of the story or actually the nature of the complaint either. And I think that's very difficult for people who have a real sense of injustice and want to actually see their complaint handled fairly, to just come up with it to people who are trying to defend the BBC rather than actually say, well, we'll look into this and see if we got it wrong. So I think if the complaint service at the BBC were improved and made perhaps even actually separated from the BBC, so it was always someone from outside the BBC that would investigate complaints against it, I think that would reassure people more often about the impartiality of the BBC. I think that getting something wrong is easy, and actually saying we got it wrong is difficult, but actually not allowing that conversation to have at all is what's damaging the BBC at the moment. Well, there's an old saying, isn't there, about today's news is tomorrow's chip paper, and I think that's very true. What I find interesting now, though, is because news is so immediate now, things, I mean, I'm on Twitter quite often because news stories break first on Twitter. You'll get it on Twitter before it's on the BBC News website, or anything like that. And it's interesting about newspapers because by the time the newspapers come out the next day, it feels like they're covering day-old news because we've all been reading this stuff since 10 o'clock the previous day. So it's a real challenge for newspapers to keep up. And I think that's why, as we mentioned the Daily Mail website, why so many newspapers now have online presence as well, just so they can keep up with stories. It's very tricky, I think, and I think the life of a story is very different because it can burn out within a few hours and not necessarily even make the print edition of a newspaper these days as well. And a lot of it is, I think, built around how much interest is there online as well. So if there's a lot of interest in a story online, I think that's making it more likely it'll be in the paper the next day. But it's an interesting question actually. How much life does a news story have these days? It's very interesting. I can't answer that question. Anything else?
Do you have a favourite scandal?
A favourite scandal? I'll tell you the most shocking scandal that I've ever read about, and it's actually one. All the scandals in my book are based on real events, and this comes from the 90s. And there's an actor called Anthony Perkins who was in Psycho. I went to see lots of other films as well, but that's the role he was most famous for. And in the 90s, he went into hospital for a minor surgery, and he had some blood taken, and the nurse, without telling him, sent his blood off to be tested for HIV because obviously they wanted to check, but he didn't give his permission for that. He was married at the time, and what the story that his wife tells is that his blood came back HIV positive, but rather than tell him or his wife that he was HIV positive, the nurse sold the story to the National Enquirer. And so the following week, she and her husband were in the local supermarket, and there's a front page of the National Enquirer that Anthony Perkins had AIDS, which is the story that they used to say if you had HIV, they thought you had AIDS. And it was just a really shocking way for him to find out, bearing in mind he didn't even know he'd had his blood tested. I still struggle with that story. When the first time I read it, it just sat with me. And I just thought that was such a horrible invasion of privacy, not just by the nurse, but by the National Enquirer itself, who bought the story. And a horrible way for someone to find out that they had at the time a condition that was, a fatal condition, because we didn't have the medication for it at the time. And of course, it is actually what he died from in the end as well. But that sort of sense of corruption, of buying people's lives, of not caring about the impact that they have on people, that's really one of the stories that sat with me. The other one that sat with me, and I don't know if you remember this chap, but he was the actor who played Mark Fowler in EastEnders when it first started many years ago, and he was a young actor, and he was a lovely-looking young lad. No, Todd Carty was the guy that played it separately. I forgot what his name is now, but it was his first big role, and of course EastEnders just exploded. Everyone that was in EastEnders suddenly became incredibly famous across the UK, and he really struggled with fame. He really struggled with his mental health, and this is back in the 80s when mental health wasn't really something that people talked about. And he kind of retracted from the programme. He sort of hid, and then the papers got this idea that he was a weirdo and he was odd, and they needed to expose what was going on. And he basically went on the run to try and get away from the press, and they pursued him across the country, not caring at all about his mental health. And he committed suicide at Beachy Head. And even at that time, there just was not the sense of horror in the way that there was 10 years later when obviously Princess Diana died in not dissimilar circumstances. And that's another story that really sits with me as well, that a young man who would still be alive today took his own life really because of the horrible treatment of the press and the way they pursued him, even when he was clearly very unwell mentally. So stories like that, which are shocking and scandalous, but actually are about real human beings being treated in the most appalling way and no sense at all of their feelings or their mental health well-being as well. And there are a lot of those stories. If you actually look through the history of the tabloid media in this country alone, there are a lot of stories like that.
I actually do struggle, saying that, I do struggle with when they invade somebody who's just had some journalists invade the home or workplace of somebody who's just really had something awful happen, and there doesn't seem to be any let up to it.
No, there was. I know that they've now got procedures in place at airports, for instance. So if there's a plane accident, the press are not allowed in where the relatives are being collected to be briefed. So that's a change, because obviously it was horrible. Remember back in the 80s, 90s, people were crying because they just found out their loved one had died, and the press is saying, how does it feel? Well, my wife's just been killed, how do you think it feels? It's awful. And I think that's really, really important. I still don't think there is a sense of responsibility in terms of hounding people. And I think about Caroline Flack in particular, who took her own life just a couple of years ago. And that was something that was very much built around the press building a story about her, to the point where she felt she had no option but to take her own life. And that was terribly, terribly sad. So even in recent history, we've got examples of the press just not thinking, if we keep going after this celebrity, they might take their own life. We need to think about that as a real possibility. And I just don't see that that's changed.
Although interestingly, that doesn't apply to Meghan Markle.
And she's spoken about having suicidal thoughts as well.
That's
And
right.
and it is shocking. It's shocking. But I don't really see there's an answer to it yet. I just think that there are newspapers that feel that it sells newspapers, so they're going to keep doing it, and it will take something like the most awful thing for them to be held to account. But we had this after Princess Diana died. I mean, there was a tsunami of anger against the tabloid press and the paparazzi after Princess Diana died. Where did that anger go? What happened to it? Where was the accountability after that? It just all disappeared. And really, that there is a sense still that people got away with it in the same way that there was a feeling that with the phone hacking scandal as well.
So how did you do your research into the murders for your next book then?
Oh, what I wanted to do, some of them are quite technical actually. What I wanted to do was make sure that each of the murders was quite creative and actually reflective of whatever offence that the victim had caused to the murderer. So, if I'm just thinking if I could give you an example of one that doesn't give too much away, but so I'll give you this as an example. It actually is one that happens before the narrative begins, so it's referenced as one. But there's a particularly cruel TV critic who used to really, really attack a particular actress on a weekly basis and ridicule her and say that she was drunk on screen and everything. And so the killer basically drops a giant television on him, which is quite good fun, and crushes him to death. So it's so all of the murders, they're quite good fun actually, to be honest, as murders go. But they're all very reflective of whatever the offence that the person has caused. Some of them were quite technical, so I did have to do some research in terms of, okay, how would this work? But one of the things I found out, I worked with a copy editor on this one, which I've not done before, and she was great because the advice she was copy editing is different to proofreading, because they look through the narrative of a book and they'll say, okay, within this section, you need to explain this, because the reader, it could be something as simple as, this person's walked into their house. You haven't said they closed the front door after them. Is the front door open or is it closed? Because a reader's going to be sat there thinking, well, I don't understand if the front door's still open. And it's little things like that. But it can also be bigger things that by the end of the story, they're saying, this is all great, but this character here, you need to explain something about them much earlier in the book so the reader is aware of that much earlier in the book. So it was a really interesting process to go through that I've not been through before. And she actually picked up a few issues around some of the murders and said, this is fine, but you need to foreshadow this a bit earlier on so that it makes a bit more sense when it happens. And so copy editing is a new thing for me, but it was actually really, really useful in terms of making sure the murders worked. I think there's a saying, there's only 7 stories, and every story is basically a rewriting of one of those 7 stories. I mean, I think that I did a lot of research around serial killer novels, and the things I found out about serial killer novels is mostly they're about serial killers murdering all women, and actually almost all the murder victims in my book are men apart from one, so that was different. It tends to be serial killers who have a particular way of killing people, and so my book's different from that because every single murder is completely different and uses a very different technique. There tends to be a male hero in the book as well, and actually the hero in my book is a 57-year-old female Tory, which is quite unusual, to be honest, for these days. So that was different as well. So I am trying to do something different with this particular book, which I hope readers will find fun. But it's very difficult because even now I'm thinking, God, I hope someone else hasn't done this. And you don't know because you can't read every single book in the world, but there's always a temptation to think maybe someone else has already done something like this, but I'll find out. I think what I've really tried to do in both my books is take awful characters but make you see why they're awful. So my first book is about really salacious, corrupt newspaper executives and reporters, but you actually learn a lot about their stories, and you find out that they weren't always bad, or that perhaps they don't even realise what they're doing is bad, or you see why they got to that place in their life where they're willing to write stories in that way. And I know a lot of the feedback I got from readers is that they felt quite compromised, that by the end of the book they weren't quite sure who they should feel sorry for. You know, should they still be with the actor who's taking revenge, or should they feel sorry for the journalist whose lives he's wrecking? I think it's probably not quite like that with my second book, but I think certainly with the victims who have all done appalling things in their life and are being targeted by this serial killer because of the appalling things they've done, I think the readers might be challenged in terms of whether they feel sorry for the victims in this book or whether they actually think, good on you, you know, we shall see, I suppose. But I think it's worth never making things completely black and white in a book. I don't think that when you're dealing with newspaper journalists, you can just say, well, they're clearly the bad guys, therefore you should dislike them, because I think that would actually make for quite a boring read as well. So I'd like to think that the characters in my book are quite well-rounded and that you do have lots of different feelings about. Well, that's my hour, and my throat's going quite dry, so I've got a bottle of Prosecco drink here.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.